Okay, this is the second part of the video lectures on research components and research methods and research papers. Um, at the end of the last slide, we talked about the five-paragraph essay. Starting with this video, we're going to start with what you need to have in your opening paragraph. You definitely need to have a hook. The hook has to be your first sentence. Ideally, I think you guys with the five-paragraph essay were taught that your thesis statement should be the last sentence of your paragraph. That's fine. But if you can hook the reader with your thesis statement and put that as your first sentence, that's fantastic. If you do that, if you make your first sentence your hook and your thesis statement, then you move through a brief overview of your points, and then your last sentence is either the thesis statement if you haven't combined that with your hook, or you restate your thesis in a new and interesting way. Now, moving forward into rhetoric, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because rhetoric is very boring, but it's kind of important. And you probably should have learned this, and you should have learned this in English 100. If you took my English 100, you definitely learned it. So rhetoric is, when we hear the word rhetoric, we often think of lying and associated with politics. But rhetoric in the rhetorical situations, it's really an art form in antiquity. It was started by Aristotle, and it's the art of persuasion through communication. So if you're writing an argumentative paper, you need to use rhetorical strategies to persuade your reader. There's a video here on rhetoric that I make my students watch in English 100. If you want to watch it again, you can. You'll be able to download this slideshow, so if you want to watch it, go for it. I'm not going to make you watch it right now, though. Contemporarily, rhetoric is, like I said, it's the art of persuasion through communication, but it can be even broadened to encapsulate any situation in which two or more people are consciously communicating with one another. Identification. So there's this persuasive component to rhetoric, but then there's also this identification component to rhetoric. And what identification really means is the analysis of writing. So when you analyze writing, when you write to communicate, you can persuade someone effectively, but when you are reading something that somebody else has written, you will be able to identify the rhetorical strategies used to persuade you as the reader. And then writing is manipulation. We've talked about this countless times already. All writing is manipulation in some form, unless it's a to-do list. But ultimately, that could be. You could argue that that's a form of manipulation. You're trying to manipulate yourself into getting your tasks completed. So, like I just was saying, you need to understand rhetoric for the synthesis of writing, for the creation of writing, or any communication, and then the analysis of writing. Now, these are this is called Aristotle's rhetorical situation. So logos is logic or reasoning. Ethos is credibility or trustworthiness. Pathos or pathos is emotional appeal. Telos is the attitude or purpose. Contemporarily, in antiquity, it meant attitude, but in contemporary rhetoric, it means purpose. So what your purpose is for writing. And then kairos, contemporarily means setting. And setting does not, in this context, setting does not mean, when and where the piece of writing takes place. It's when and where the writing was composed. So often, some famous speeches, some famous books, pieces of writing were composed anywhere, but they might have been composed 100 years ago. So that setting of, this piece of writing being from 100 years ago can help provide context to why the writer chose to compose this piece. Here's the rhetorical triangles. Here you have ethos, speaker or writer, logos, the message or reason. Remember, logos is logic, ethos is credibility or trustworthiness, and then pathos is the emotional appeal, so audience or appeal, and then the purpose is somewhere in the middle. This is kind of the more contemporary. We don't necessarily, some instructors use these terms, ethos, logos, pathos. I typically don't. I use, author, audience, and purpose. Purpose is in here, and here's the subject or topic. And this is all within the circle of context. And context is setting. So a famous example of a good example of this would be Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. So Dr. Martin Luther King is the author. The topic is, the acquisition of civil rights, we'll call it that. Or the purpose is to persuade people in the persuade the country into enacting civil rights legislation. And then the audience is, at the time, the audience was those gathered at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in 1963 for the speech. The context or setting is, it's a speech. I'm not exactly sure where it was written, but the speech was given in Washington, D.C. in the National Mall in 1963. So the context, the setting, 1963 during the Civil Rights Movement, directly affects who the author was, why they chose the topic, and who the audience was, and what their purpose was, and that's something important to keep in mind. So these are the elements of contemporary rhetoric, which is text. This is any form of communication, really. But for the purpose of this class, it's written documents. It's your research paper, your short story, your craft papers, those things. Medium of texts, that's exactly what I was just saying. Tools to synthesize text, to create a text. Computer, before computers and word processing software, it was typewriters and then, pen and paper. Author, what is an author? That's you. Author and authority, we've already talked about this. We've already talked about the influence of your background on your writing. Audience, for the purpose of this class, the audience is your peers and myself. But, say you go on to publish something, hypothetically you publish something that you've written in this class, then your audience changes. It becomes much larger than what the original audience was, and this often happens with writing. And then you have to also keep in mind the influence of the audience's background. You could, say I'm writing a novel, which the novel I'm writing for, there's a certain audience. I'm writing for, 30-something, late 20s, early 30s, people who have recently discovered that they're disenchanted with life and their career. So you need to make assumptions about the audience when you're composing your piece of writing. Purposes, there's the author's purpose, which is you're either going to inform, persuade, or entertain, or a combination of the three. All writing should be entertaining in some form. You need to entertain the reader, or you're not going to keep their attention. And then you're going to inform them, you're going to provide them with information, or you're going to persuade them. Audience's purpose. An audience, this purpose can either be active or passive. They can be actively seeking information, or they can be passively just receiving it. So think of, when you're working and you have the TV on in the background, you're still receiving information, but you're not actively paying attention to it. Or when you hear music or announcements at the mall or doctor's office or whatever, you're not actively seeking that information, but you're passively receiving it. Attitude, this kind of goes back to the background knowledge. Just think of keep your attitudes, your prejudices in mind, and make assumptions about your audiences when you're writing. And then setting, time and place, context, we've talked about that. I discussed the I Have a Dream speech, but Romeo and Juliet, Great Gatsby, and Fight Club, these all became popular pieces of writing because of the time period they were written in. Romeo and Juliet probably wouldn't be a tragedy about warring families probably wouldn't be wildly successful today. Same with The Great Gatsby. If this book was written today, nobody would care. Fight Club. Um, Fight Club is still prescient in our society, so that one could probably still be written today. I mean, I guess it's almost 20 years old now. I'm gonna stop this video here, and the third one will pick up here with argumentative and persuasive writing.